So I really went back and forth about whether to even do this story today about how there still is no connection between undocumented immigrants and criminality, because on the one hand, we've already covered this story. It's sort of obvious that this is the case, but there are still so many people who believe, deeply believe, that undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit crimes in the United States. So ultimately, I made the case that it is worth debunking once again. And before I even tell you about the new report, let's just remind ourselves of some of the obvious realities. Coming to the United States illegally is illegal. It can be a misdemeanor or a civil infraction, depending on whether you've overstayed a visa or are crossing the border without permission. That's not what's at issue here, okay? What is at issue here is whether undocumented immigrants do or do not commit more crime than native-born Americans, or more crime than legal immigrants to the United States. And we hear a lot of specific anecdotes from Donald Trump and right-wingers who have propagandized around this about crimes committed by undocumented immigrants. And of course, in a country this big, there are examples of everything. But this is important because our policy towards immigration would be different depending on whether or not undocumented immigrants actually are more likely to commit violent crime and property crime in the United States. But this is pretty obvious. Undocumented immigrants know that they are undocumented. They know that if they get into trouble with the authorities, if they come to the attention of law enforcement, not only could they suffer the penalties for the crime that they commit, but they could be deported. They could get in trouble for being undocumented. So why would a group that knows they have an extra incentive to stay off the radar of law enforcement, why would they commit crimes at a higher rate than native-born Americans and legal immigrants and attract the attention of law enforcement? Yes, we know that poverty and crime are connected. Many undocumented immigrants are poor. But the research has shown for a long time that undocumented immigrants aren't more likely to be violent criminals. And yet again, we have a new study with Pew data, Pew Research Center data, analyzed by the Marshall Project, which tells us that undocumented immigrants don't increase crime rates. Whether or not undocumented immigration to a metro area increased, the crime rates have continued to slowly decline more or less equally. And in fact, there are many areas with more undocumented immigration that have had even larger decreases in crime, even though it's by a small amount and maybe not statistically significant. Now, this is not to argue that we shouldn't deal with undocumented immigration, which is still a crime, right? Although it's only a civil infraction or a misdemeanor, again, depending on whether you're talking about an overstayed visa or crossing the border without permission. But we cannot allow this discussion to be framed as we have a crisis of violent undocumented immigrants in the United States, because we don't. And this is actually the epitome of how the Republican Party often very successfully influences public opinion. The principle is they take an anecdote and they exploit it to make people scared or angry and to eventually support bad policy that doesn't actually make sense. So let me do an analogy first to abortion. They come out, they say, extreme late-term abortions have to be stopped. Democrats are killing babies. This is horrible. When you look at it, you realize, wait a second, extreme late-term abortion is really rare. And when it's something that takes place, the baby often is going to die anyway, within days or weeks of coming out of the uterus. And it more becomes a question of the life of the mother. It becomes a question of how soon is this fetus going to be determined non-viable. But Republicans use the straw man of the post-birth abortion and all of these crazy things to justify trying to ban abortion altogether. This is the same thing going on with undocumented immigration. An illegal, as they like to say, killed this person. Well, that's a crime. It's a tragedy. It's horrifying. Okay, I would not even think of minimizing the horrible nature of that. But the real discussion around undocumented immigration is not actually about crime. It's about economics. It's about culture. It's about geopolitics. It's about diplomacy and foreign relations and foreign policy. That's the real conversation around undocumented immigration. And the problem is that if you actually have the conversation on those terms, instead of about these crimes that Donald Trump and others like to point to, the outcome, the right path forward becomes one that the American right simply doesn't want. It becomes one of working to minimize the circumstances in the source countries of undocumented immigration that make people want to come here to begin with. It becomes an issue of dealing with the economic conditions and the large corporations that are actually a big driver for that undocumented immigration because they are employing undocumented immigrants. If you actually deal with undocumented immigration as an economic, cultural, and geopolitical issue, you can't justify the policies that Republicans want, which is why they have to couch it in these terms of dangerous brown people coming over the border. Yet another study tells us it's absolutely ridiculous.